The non-techie person relies on the magic words of someone in authority that says certain things can be trusted because that person says so. In this world, though, we've figured out that just because someone says so doesn't mean it is true. Whether the person of authority is Tim Cook of Apple or the head of the CDC or the director of a three-letter agency, you need to understand clearly what is being said, or you can be duped. What I will talk about is that the pinnacle of trust in our internet lives may not always be trusted. I will discuss the encryption used in web browsers and internet communications in general. It used to be called SSL or Secure Sockets Layer and was integrated into your browsers as the HTTPS protocol. That's why you type in that HTTPS when you access a website. This is now called TLS or Transport Security Layer. This whole encryption scheme is based on digital certificates, and you will hear reference about these certificates having public and private keys. This is the basis of encryption of most of what we do today in our everyday internet lives. But did you know that this encryption scheme can be cracked? Sometimes it is done intentionally if you're the owner of the device, sometimes it is done by employers and governments, and sometimes it is done by hackers. There's a lot of past drama in the story as well, and caused the collapse of one of the biggest tech companies. It is also important for you if you want to know if you really have security and privacy at any given moment. Is this interesting enough for you to learn about? If you're interested, stay right there. The world of encryption can be complicated, and I can pretty much guarantee that even techies who install TLS certificates on their websites may not truly understand how this whole TLS encryption scheme works. It's even more confusing when it used to be called SSL certificate since Netscape invented it 20 plus years ago, and now it is called TLS. But I think most people have heard of some sort of certificates being used on websites to ensure that it can support HTTPS. The premise being that once you connect to a website with HTTPS, then your session is supposedly fully encrypted. This protection is provided by these TLS certificates. TLS certificates contain the encryption keys that are used to encrypt the traffic. There's two parts to it. There's a public key portion, and then there's the private key portion that is not supposed to be distributed outside of the owner's control. This idea of encryption using a combination of public and private keys is technically called asymmetric encryption. This is where two parties negotiate an encryption key without knowing the encryption key in advance. Another method of encryption is called symmetric encryption. This is when two parties to the conversation have the same key, and thus no negotiations are necessary. The idea of negotiating encryption without knowing a key in advance is, of course, a mainstay of internet use because random devices are talking to each other. So TLS is what allows the internet to be robust and mostly encrypted. But these TLS certificates have a flaw, and the flaw is that a TLS certificate is based on trust. And if someone lies to us and abuses that trust, we lose. I will tell you an interesting story that shows how this trust was destroyed by a company that wanted to profit from surveillance, which in turn caused that particular company to implode. Then I will talk about how this same technique is used by others today to intercept and observe your encrypted internet traffic and what it could potentially mean for us. Before I do that, let me give you a brief explanation of how TLS encryption works. The original idea for TLS is that there are two certificates, a public certificate and a private certificate. The public certificate is used to encrypt the content. The private certificate is used to decrypt the content. So if you went to an online store and entered your credit card information, The public key will be used to encrypt your traffic, but only the party that has the private key can decrypt. That's a very simplified explanation. In reality, the key exchange results in an exchange of a symmetric key so that the two parties can talk to each other, encrypted on both sides, but that just complicates it. Secondarily, the public key will have some sort of identification of the owner of the certificate. This is to make sure that the owner of the domain is authentic. So google.com has to have been validated to actually be owned by Google. This validation is done when the certificate is issued. You can issue self-signed certificates which skip this validating step and is used for encryption between private parties, but this would not be accepted by popular browsers. Browsers like Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Edge, and so on will always check that the certificate is valid. This is done by seeing if there's a chain of trusted certificates which validate the current certificate. The top level is made up of root certificates issued by a root certificate authority, and then each player that distributes certificates can subordinate that trust to other organizations lower in the chain. Each authorized player that issues a certificate is called a certificate authority. Depending on the level, some are called subordinate certificate authorities, and some are called intermediate certificate authorities. This organizational requirement ensures that only authorized and trusted parties can issue a certificate. This is important because in theory, someone in China cannot just create a domain google.com because a trusted certificate provider would have to have validated that domain. Now that you have a primer, I can now explain the many problems. And don't worry, later in the video, I can tell you how to spot these anomalies and know that your encryption is being cracked. Number one, private key compromise. The first problem is that, as I said, anyone that has the private key can decrypt the internet traffic into that website during the period that the private key is valid. So if the tech person in charge of creating the servers makes a mistake and accidentally allows access to the private key, then some hacker will be able to intercept that traffic to that website. Three-letter agencies make a habit of scouring devices for private keys. Let's say there's some old Google server hard drive with a private key on it that was used in 2020. A three-letter agency capturing a recording of encrypted internet traffic in 2020 would be able then to decrypt everything during that time period that certificate was active. You can see here that it doesn't even require that the key is used today. By the way, usually this kind of attack is limited to three letters and governments. Number two, trusted authority goes rogue. This has happened several times in history, and I will relate a big story later. But another example of this was that a Chinese company who was a trusted authority to distribute certificates started issuing fake certificates with domains like google.com, facebook.com, etc. If this rogue authority issued a fresh certificate with the name google.com, then someone in China could intercept traffic intended for google.com and have it go through a proxy that serves as a man in the middle, or MITM. Since this proxy has its own google.com and has the private key, it can decrypt all the traffic. This proxy will then forward the traffic to the real google.com, and no one would be any wiser. This actually happened, but Google discovered it. How? Well, users who use Chrome will actually have a current public certificate stored inside Chrome, hard-coded in. This means Chrome can compare a current certificate against what is being shown publicly. If the two don't match, then there's a man in the middle. Having a reference of actual Google certificates inside Chrome is called certificate pinning, and it is the defense that Google uses to ensure that no one is cheating, at least with respect to Google. Fortunately, they can do this easily since Chrome is updated very frequently. And Google is now a subordinate certificate authority. Number three, fake root authority. Now, this technique I will mention is used in the corporate world a lot for surveilling internet traffic inside an enterprise. It is also used by cybersecurity people to track traffic in a device they control using decrypting tools. This is also used by countries that want to enforce surveillance within their borders. The way to completely break down any kind of TLS encryption is to be certified as a root certificate authority. There's no actual legal procedure to do this. It's quite simple to do. Root certificates are stored on your computer by the maker of the OS. So you have a predetermined list of valid root authorities. But your employer owns your computer, so your employer inserts another root certificate on there and it is their own. And you are prohibited by your IT department from messing with your computer. This basically makes the corporate entity that issued your computer a trusted organization that can issue any certificate for any domain as long as the domain certificate points to the rogue root certificate, which means they can have a private key for any domain they create and then can intercept such traffic that is flowing through their network. Or they can just use some wildcard domain name and have a private key for it so they can see everything. Fortunately, this is not going to work with Google Chrome since it has a PIN certificate, or with any app that has a PIN certificate. All of these tricks will allow a third party to be a man in the middle. And depending on what domain was issued, they can then allow the interception of all HTTPS encrypted traffic or TLS encrypted traffic, which includes emails. So depending on the environment and who's in between, your TLS encryption may not actually be working. From a hacker point of view, if a hacker is able to replace or add a root certificate, then they can be a man in the middle. This can be done by an attack that has you clicking on some app, and though there may not be any obvious malware, the malware could be the loading of a fake root certificate. Someone with physical access to your computer can also use some rubber ducky USB device to run some program that updates your root certificates. Fortunately, just like pinning, there's a way to detect this kind of rogue activity. Though there's a limit to this detection, and I'll discuss that later as well. Many years ago, the old-time tech company Symantec decided to go evil. Everyone originally knew Symantec as the maker of Norton antivirus. They had already purchased VeriSign, which, if you didn't know, was the first root certificate authority and basically controlled the vast majority of distribution of SSL certificates in the marketplace. The first sign of the evil direction was when Symantec purchased the company Blue Coat Systems. Blue Coat Systems was into providing surveillance equipment. They provided this for corporate use as well as to countries with controlled populations. I knew there were Arab countries, Latin American countries, and so on their customer list. So one of the tools they had was an MITM tool that allowed basically surveillance of all TLS internet traffic for the corporation or country. Just to show you the corporate progress here to evil, the CEO of Blue Coat Systems then was made the CEO of the entire Symantec. I was one of the main voices on the internet talking about this evolving evil focus here. I discovered that Blue Coat Systems was made into an intermediate certificate authority, meaning that they could issue their own certificates, even though Blue Coat Systems was not in the certificate business. But of course, Symantec owned VeriSign as well as Blue Coat Systems, so they could abuse this connection. As I explained to my viewers years ago, these fake certificates are what allowed Blue Coat Systems to power their surveillance, particularly at the state level. Well, unfortunately for them, they got caught. The proof came from Google. As I mentioned earlier, Google suspected companies were faking Google.com certificates, like the China example. So it was easy enough to verify the certificate chain and see who issued the fake certificate. And of course, it was a Blue Coat Systems certificate authority. Google then had the power of the most popular browser on earth, so Google announced that Symantec or VeriSign certificates would no longer be trusted, meaning the Verizon root certificate would be ignored. Well, 80+% of the internet was using VeriSign, so this wasn't going to work. There were lots of accusations back and forth between Google and Symantec, with tons of lies from Symantec. In the end, Symantec had no choice. They were toast. Symantec also had a multi-million-dollar deal, having just bought LifeLock. So VeriSign was sold to DigiCert for a price lower than what Symantec paid for it originally. Symantec was broken up. The enterprise side, which may have included products from Blue Coat Systems, was sold to Broadcom. The new remaining company was quick to remove any reference to Symantec and was for a time called Norton LifeLock, since those were the only two products left, Norton Antivirus and LifeLock. Then they changed their name again to make sure we forget Symantec. The moral to this story is that we are basing our security on trust. We trust the root certificate authority. Unfortunately, the underpinnings of this entire trust is that we assume that the root certificate authority is not sharing private keys with any other party, like a three-letter agency. Again, let's review. Anyone with a private key can decrypt the traffic. We are led to believe that we can trust the root certificate authority to be responsible. There are bonds in place to make sure that multi-million penalties are enforced for violations of this. But multi-million penalties for possibly billions in rewards? All I'm saying is that the entire security of the internet is fragile. It is dependent on a few people in control. I'm not going to claim any possibility of rogue behavior, but it is entirely possible. With the exception of a corrupt root authority distributing private keys secretly, there are ways to detect other kinds of rogue actions. The attack that we want to detect is called an MITM attack or man-in-the-middle attack. As I already mentioned, if you're in a corporate environment using a corporate computer while you're on the corporate network, it is likely that you are compromised. Either you installed software that changed the root certificate or it was installed for you. So your traffic can be observed at will. Corporations will likely monitor any social media posting and emails, including non-corporate email. Fortunately, I have an app that can detect if you're being subjected to this. The app is on the Google Play Store or Aurora Store, and it is called Catch MITM. The way this app works is very simple. You can check any domain that you want, and then the app looks at the certificate shown for that domain on your network. Then it compares it to the certificate shown for that domain outside your network. If the certificate is valid, the signature of the certificate should be identical. If there's a difference, then someone has loaded a fake certificate and is watching your network. This is pretty easy to emulate, by the way. Some antivirus software like Avast intentionally monitors your traffic with a fake root certificate. The intended reason by Avast is to look for malware, but I cannot trust this. So Catch MITM app will always say there's an MITM when using Avast. I've submitted this app to Apple and they've rejected this app as being too simple to be in the App Store. It may be a simple interface, but it is incredibly important. It could be a definite proof that you're being hacked by an MITM. Now, I've gotten spurious results when using Google.com, and it may be that Google, being a certificate authority, has made many Google.com certificates. But Chrome can detect false Google.com certificates, so that's the secondary check. You can purposely intercept traffic as an MITM if you are a cybersecurity researcher. You pass your traffic through an HTTPS proxy computer, and that device will monitor the traffic for you. To enable this, some software has to install a fake root certificate on the target device, which is one you own. And then you pass the traffic through the HTTP proxy. A popular cybersecurity tool that does this with a nice interface is the MITM proxy. To keep connectivity simple, it can accept traffic from the source device via a WireGuard VPN connection. This captures all the traffic and keeps the setup simple. Now, don't get cocky with this tool. The limitations of an MITM proxy are that it can only decrypt TLS traffic that uses standard TLS certificates. You cannot decrypt traffic that is based on other kinds of encryption, like AES 256 using symmetrical keys. So don't assume you can see everything. Folks, I have privacy products that we make available and help support this channel. We have a Brax 2 privacy phone running an open source Brax OS. We also do flashing services to de-Google other phone models on our store, as well as stocking pre-flashed pixels. We have a VPN service, Bytes VPN, which has features like Tor routing, DNS obfuscation, and ad blocking. We have Braxmail, which is a metadata-free way of doing email where no one knows where the message originated from. These products are on my app, BraxMe. Come visit us there. The link is in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.